On my daughter's graduation day, my housekeeper pushed me into the closet and shut the door. "Don't make a sound. You need to hear this," she whispered. Seconds later, what I heard from the hallway left me completely frozen. I want to tell this the way it actually happened, which means I have to start a little earlier than the closet, because the closet only makes sense if you understand what came before it. I was 63 years old, standing in my own front hallway in pearl earrings and a good coat, 40 minutes from watching my daughter walk across a stage to collect a diploma I had helped pay for. I had been looking forward to that morning for longer than I probably should admit. My husband had been gone 6 years by then, and there is a particular kind of loneliness in watching your children reach milestones without the other person who made them with you. I had promised myself I would not cry in public. I had already broken that promise twice while doing my hair. My housekeeper had worked for our family for 11 years. I want to be precise about what that meant, because 11 years in a house is not the same as 11 years anywhere else. She had seen the inside of our medicine cabinets and our arguments and our grief. She had been in the kitchen the night we got the diagnosis that eventually took my husband, and she had made tea nobody drank and stayed until midnight without being asked. She had raised 3 children of her own, was a grandmother twice over, and had a way of looking at a room that told you she had already assessed everything in it before you'd finished walking through the door. In 11 years, she had never once raised her voice to me. She had never asked me for anything that wasn't sensible, and she had never, not one single time, been wrong about anything that mattered inside these walls. So when she gripped my wrist that morning in my own hallway, hard enough that I felt it through my coat sleeve, and said in a voice I didn't recognize, "Get in the closet, don't make a sound," I didn't argue. I want you to understand that. I am not a woman who does what she's told without question. I have run a household, raised 2 children largely on my own during the years my husband traveled for work, sat on boards, fired people, negotiated contracts. I do not generally get pushed into closets. But something in her face stopped every question in my throat before it could form, and 11 years of never being wrong bought her exactly that much trust in the space of about 4 seconds. I need to back up further still, because there were things I had noticed before that morning and chosen not to look at directly. The way you notice a stain on a ceiling and tell yourself it's probably nothing, probably just old water damage, and go about your day. My daughter was 29. She had been, for most of her life, the kind of person other people described as sharp in both senses of the word. She had gotten her MBA the way she did most things, with a controlled ferocity I had always admired and occasionally worried about. She had never, even as a child, been particularly sentimental, and I sometimes wondered, uncharitably, whether her tears at the right moments came from genuine feeling or from knowing precisely which moments called for them. She had met her fiancé 14 months before that graduation morning. He was 38, 9 years older than her, and worked in something involving investment structures that I never fully understood, despite several attempts at dinner table explanations. He was, by any objective measure, extremely handsome, in the specific way of men who have learned exactly how to use a face like that. He had a way of ordering wine without asking anyone else's preference. He had a way of mentioning, within the first 20 minutes of any conversation, some detail that let you know approximately how much money he had, dressed up as a casual aside. He had told me once, at a dinner I hosted, about a property he owned on a lake 3 hours north, and had done so in a tone that made it clear he expected me to be either impressed or slightly threatened, and seemed faintly disappointed when I was neither. I had watched them together at that dinner and felt something I couldn't name at the time. Not dislike exactly, but unease, the kind you feel when 2 puzzle pieces fit together and you're still not sure the picture is one you'd want on your wall. I told myself it was only the ordinary difficulty of watching your child choose someone who isn't you, and filed the feeling away in the drawer where I keep things I hope I'm wrong about. There had been small moments, though, that I'd noticed and set aside individually, the way you might notice individual raindrops without registering that it's actually started to rain. 6 months earlier, at a family dinner, my daughter had asked, almost offhandedly, "What happens to the trust if I get married before you turn 70? I remember answering honestly that the trust would distribute according to its terms regardless of her marital status, that her father and I had structured it to protect what we'd built together for both our children equally, and that marriage wouldn't change the mechanics unless I specifically amended it to. She had nodded, seemingly satisfied, and the conversation had moved on to something about the caterer for the engagement party. I hadn't thought about it again until much later, when I understood it for what it actually was, which was reconnaissance. There had also been the afternoon, perhaps 4 months before the graduation, when I'd mentioned to her that I was thinking of updating some of my estate paperwork, mostly routine things, and I'd watched something flicker across her face that I registered at the time as mild interest and only later recognized as alarm. I am telling you these things now, in order, because I want you to understand that the morning in the closet was not the beginning of anything. It was the moment everything I had chosen not to look at directly finally arranged itself into a shape I could no longer avoid seeing. The stain on the ceiling turned out not to be old water damage. It turned out to be something actively getting worse above my head the entire time I'd been telling myself not to worry about it. That morning, the car service was due at 9:15 to take me to the university. I remember checking my watch obsessively in the way you do when you're anxious about being late to something that matters enormously to you. I remember the particular quality of the light coming through the hallway windows, the kind of clean early light you get on a good morning in late spring. I remember thinking, with an embarrassing swell of pride, that I had raised a daughter who was about to have letters after her name that neither her father nor I had ever managed, and that he would have been unbearable about it, would have told the story to every stranger in a 5 5-mile radius for the rest of the year. I did not know, standing there checking my watch, that within the next hour I would learn something about that daughter that would make the letters after her name feel like the least important thing I would ever learn about her. My housekeeper had been unusually quiet that morning. I noticed it and attributed it to the early hour. She had arrived at 7, earlier than her usual start time, which she explained by saying she wanted to get the kitchen finished before I left, so the house would be tidy when I got back with guests. This seemed reasonable at the time. It did not seem reasonable in retrospect once I understood that she had in fact been waiting. At 9 o'clock, 15 minutes before my car was due, I heard her footsteps coming quickly down the hall toward where I stood at the mirror by the front door, adjusting an earring that did not need adjusting. I turned, already smiling, already halfway into a comment about the time, and the smile died somewhere between forming and reaching my face because I had never seen that particular expression on her before. She looked, I would say now, like someone who had spent weeks preparing for a moment she'd hoped would never actually arrive, and it had just arrived anyway. "Get in the closet," she said, already moving me toward it with a hand on my arm. "Don't make a sound. You need to hear this. If I just tell you, you won't believe me." I wouldn't have believed me either. And then the door was closing, and I was standing in the dark between my late husband's old winter coats and a row of umbrellas we never used because we always forgot to bring them, and I thought absurdly in that first disoriented second, I am a 63-year-old woman hiding in my own coat closet, and he would have laughed himself sick at the sight of this, but he wasn't there to laugh, and my housekeeper had never, in 11 years, asked me for anything that wasn't sensible, so I stayed. The closet door doesn't latch all the way. I hadn't known that until that morning. My housekeeper apparently had known it for some time, which told me, even before anything else happened, that this was not the first time she'd thought about this particular hiding place, that she had done some quiet testing of her own before she ever put her hand on my wrist. I heard the front door open perhaps 90 seconds after the closet door shut. I heard 2 sets of footsteps come down the hardwood of the front hall, and I felt something in my chest tighten before I'd even identified the voices, some animal part of me registering danger before my conscious mind had caught up. The first voice was my daughter's. I would know it anywhere, in any context, the particular cadence of it that had been familiar to me since before she could form full sentences. The second voice was lower, careful, moving through the house the way someone moves through a room they don't want to be caught in. "He thinks she already left," my daughter was saying. "The car service isn't due for another 20 minutes, and the housekeeper told him I already went ahead. We have time." I stood absolutely still between the coats. Time, I remember thinking. Time for what? Some part of me was still expecting this to resolve into something innocent, some forgotten detail about the graduation itself, a misplaced gift, anything. I want to be honest that I was still, in that moment, actively working to construct an innocent explanation, the way you do when the alternative is something you aren't ready to hold. The second voice, her fiancé's voice, said something I didn't catch, and then my daughter laughed, a short practical laugh, not her real laugh, I would come to understand later, but a laugh she used when she was moving quickly through a checklist of things that needed doing. "It's upstairs," she said. "Top drawer of my old jewelry box, the one she gave me for my 16th birthday. She keeps the good pieces in the safe, but the everyday things are just sitting there." I heard footsteps moving toward the staircase. I heard them pause. "Which pieces specifically?" he asked, and his voice had a particular quality to it that I would spend a long time afterward trying to characterize accurately to myself. Not excited, exactly. Businesslike. The voice of a man discussing line items. "The emerald set, obviously," my daughter said. "That's the one that's actually insured for real money. 11,000, I think, maybe closer to 12 with the earrings included. And maybe the pearls, though those are only worth about 400, so it's honestly not worth the trouble unless we're taking everything at once anyway." I stood in the dark and felt something in me go very quiet and very cold at the same time. An odd combination I hadn't experienced before and have thought about many times since. My own daughter, discussing the insurance value of my jewelry with the flat competence of someone reviewing a spreadsheet. "If it goes missing before the wedding," he said, footsteps resuming, moving up the staircase now, nobody questions it twice. "People misplace things, especially older people, especially in the run-up to a big family event when there's a lot going on. She files a claim, the insurance pays out at replacement value, we split whatever we take on top of what she probably won't even miss for months, and your mother never has to know her jewelry box got any lighter." I heard my daughter's footsteps following his up the stairs. I heard the particular creak of the 4th step, the one that had been creaking since before she was born and that her father had always meant to fix and never did. I heard more distantly now, drawers opening and closing above me. My bedroom. My jewelry box, the one that had, in fact, been a gift for her 16th birthday, chosen carefully because he thought a girl her age deserved somewhere pretty to keep her things, not knowing that 11 years later she would use its contents as a source of untraceable income. I want to try to describe what I felt in that moment, standing in the dark surrounded by my husband's old coats, listening to my daughter and the man she planned to marry discuss defrauding an insurance company using jewelry from my own bedroom. I had expected, if I had expected anything at all, that I would feel rage. I had a vague sense, before that morning, of what learning something terrible about someone you love was supposed to feel like. Some Hollywood version involving hot, immediate anger, maybe tears, some dramatic internal combustion. What I actually felt was smaller and much stranger. I felt the floor of my own life tilt very slightly, the way a piece of furniture shifts when you've been leaning on it for years without realizing how much of your weight it was actually holding. I felt more than anything a kind of vertigo. The sense that the ground I had been standing on for 29 years, the assumption that I understood the basic shape of who my daughter was, had just proven to be considerably less solid than I'd believed. I heard them come back down the stairs. I heard my daughter's heels on the hardwood, a sound I had heard 10,000 times over the years and had never once, until that morning, found frightening. "That should be enough for now," she said. "We can come back for the rest closer to the date, once we've figured out the timing with the claim. I don't want to be greedy about it and take everything at once. That's how people get caught, taking too much too fast." "Smart," he said, and there was something in his tone, an approval, almost fond, that I found in some ways more disturbing than anything either of them had said about the jewelry itself. It was the tone of a man complimenting a promising employee. It was not, I noted with a kind of distant, clinical horror, the tone anyone would use with someone they were being coerced or manipulated by. It was the tone you use with an equal, a collaborator. I stood there in the dark and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, like something clicking into place in my chest, that whatever this was, my daughter was not a victim of it. I braced myself in that moment for them to leave. I thought absurdly about what I would say to my housekeeper once the door opened, how I would begin to process what I'd just heard, whether I would even make it to the graduation at all given the state I was clearly about to be in. I did not know, standing there bracing for the front door to close behind them, that the worst of it hadn't arrived yet. I thought I had just heard the reason for the closet. I had not. Instead of footsteps moving toward the front door, I heard a chair scrape against the kitchen floor. I heard the particular sound of someone sitting down with the settled quality of a person who has more to say and intends to take their time saying it. "I want you to talk to me honestly about the trust structure," her fiancé said, and his voice had shifted again into something more careful, more deliberate. "Because the jewelry is fine, it's a nice bit of extra cushion, but it's not actually the thing I'm interested in, and I think you know that." There was a pause. I stood in the dark and found that I had, without noticing, stopped breathing properly, taking in air in small, careful sips instead of full breaths, as though the house itself might hear me if I breathed too loudly. My daughter's voice, when it came, had changed again, dropped into something lower and steadier, a register I recognized from years of watching her prepare for things that mattered to her. The voice she used to use rehearsing school presentations after she'd actually done the reading. The voice of someone who had turned an idea over enough times that it had lost its capacity to unsettle her. "The trust distributes when she turns 70 or when she dies, whichever comes first," she said. "If she dies before 70, everything accelerates immediately. No waiting period, straight to me and my brother in equal shares. If she makes it to 70, it still distributes on schedule regardless, but obviously that's 3 more years from now, and 3 years is a long time." I heard him ask, in a tone that struck me as almost gentle, almost solicitous, what she was actually saying. "I'm saying she's 63, my daughter said. People have accidents. People fall downstairs. People have strokes that come out of nowhere. People have heart problems nobody knew about until it's too late. It happens constantly. It happens to healthy-seeming people all the time, and when it happens, nobody looks twice at it, because why would they? Nobody investigates a 63-year-old woman who dies of something that looks natural. They just grieve and move on and settle the estate. I want to tell you what it is to hear those words about yourself, spoken by your own child, in the flat, practical tone of someone discussing a household budget, and I have concluded there isn't really a way to convey it to someone who hasn't lived it directly. It is not like fear, which has a shape your body already knows how to answer. This was something else. The specific vertigo of realizing that the person you carried for 9 months, whose fevers you sat up monitoring, whose heart you assumed you understood better than your own, had apparently been quietly weighing your death as a solution to a timing problem. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stood between my husband's coats and I listened to my daughter continue, because some part of me, even in the depths of that horror, still needed to understand the full shape of what I was hearing rather than flinching away from it. "Obviously, I'm not saying we do anything," she continued, and there was, I noted even then, a strange quality to that sentence, an emphasis that felt less like a genuine disavowal and more like the kind of thing you say out loud specifically so that it exists as something you said, a sentence built for later use rather than for actual sincerity. "I'm just saying that if something were to happen, the timing would work out considerably better for us than if we have to wait 3 years for her to turn 70 naturally. That's all I'm saying. It's just useful information to have." Her fiancé said something then that I have replayed in my mind more times than almost anything else from that morning. He said, "You've thought about this a lot." And my daughter said without any hesitation at all, without the smallest hitch that might have suggested discomfort with the question, "Of course I have. I think about everything a lot. That's why you're marrying me." I stood in the closet and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost merciful in its bluntness, that I had misunderstood the entire shape of what was happening in my house that morning from the very first sentence I'd overheard. I had assumed, walking into this, that I was witnessing a young man corrupting my daughter, teaching her something ugly that she was too naive or too in love to recognize for what it was. I had constructed, without realizing I was doing it, a story in which my daughter was fundamentally the same person I had always believed her to be, merely under the influence of someone worse than her. That story was wrong. It was the reverse of what was actually happening. My daughter was not the one being taught. She was the one explaining the mechanics, patiently, with the settled confidence of someone who had already turned this particular idea over many times, alone, long before she ever brought it to him. Whatever he was, whatever pattern of behavior he might have brought into this relationship, my daughter had met him more than halfway. She had, if anything, been the one doing the teaching. I don't know how long the silence lasted after that. Time did something strange to me in that closet, stretching and compressing in ways that made it difficult afterward to reconstruct an accurate timeline. I know that eventually I heard him say they should go before the car service arrived that it would look strange for both of them to still be in the house. I heard my daughter's heels moving across the hardwood toward the front door. I allowed myself, for the first time since the front door had originally opened, a small measure of relief, the beginning of an exhale I had apparently been holding for what felt like several minutes. Then I heard her stop. "I forgot my umbrella," she said. "It's in that closet. I left it there last time I visited." I heard her footsteps change direction. I heard them approach, closer, closer, until they stopped directly outside the door I was standing behind. Close enough that I could hear the small sounds of her adjusting her bag on her shoulder. Close enough that the 6 inches of closet door between us felt, in that instant, like nothing at all. Her hand closed around the handle. I heard her fingers find the latch. I felt, more than heard, the mechanism begin to give, that particular give of a door about to open. I do not know what I would have said in that moment if the door had opened all the way. I do not know what my face would have done. Standing there among the coats with the whole conversation still ringing in my ears, my daughter's own voice discussing the timing of my death still hanging in the air between us. I have wondered about it since, turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, and I have never arrived at an answer I trust. I did not have to find out. From the kitchen, calm as anything, entirely unhurried, my housekeeper's voice cut through the hallway. "Is this yours? I found it by the front door already. Must have set it down when you came in." A pause. I heard my daughter's hand release the handle. I physically felt, the small mechanical give of the latch settling back into place, and something in my chest that had been clenched since the first footstep unclenched by perhaps 1 degree. "Oh, thank you," my daughter said, her voice perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, the voice of a woman who had not, 90 seconds earlier, been discussing the statistical likelihood of her mother's accidental death. I heard her footsteps move away from the closet, toward the kitchen, toward the front door, toward whatever came next in a morning that, for her, was apparently continuing exactly as planned. I heard the front door open. I heard it close. I heard, faintly through the walls, the sound of a car door, an engine, tires on the driveway gravel, and then nothing at all. I stood in the dark for what felt like a very long time after that, though I'm told by my housekeeper that it was closer to 90 seconds. I remember pressing my fingers against the sleeve of my husband's old coat, the wool worn soft after all these years, and thinking, with a strange detached clarity, that this was probably the last ordinary moment I was going to get to have for a while, and that I should try to notice it properly before it ended. Then the closet door opened all the way, and my housekeeper was standing there, and she didn't say anything at all. She just looked at me, and her eyes asked a question her mouth didn't need to. And I shook my head, very slightly, because I was not, in fact, all right, and I suspected I would not be all right again for some time. She reached out and straightened my pearl earring, which had gone crooked somewhere in the dark. Then she handed me my coat, the good one, the one I'd been wearing before all of this started, and she said, in a voice that was steady in a way I found I badly needed just then, "We have some time before the car comes back around. Come sit down, I'll make coffee." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten breakfast that morning without any idea of what the day actually held, and my housekeeper made coffee neither of us drank, and she told me, in the careful, methodical way she did most things, everything she had learned since March. I want to say clearly that I had not asked her to investigate anything. I had not asked her to watch my daughter or listen for anything unusual, or do any of the things she had apparently spent the better part of 3 months doing. She had done it entirely on her own initiative, and when I asked her, later that week, why, she looked at me for a long moment and said simply, "Because I've worked in this house long enough to know what it sounds like when something is wrong in it, and I've raised enough children of my own to know the difference between a young person making a mistake and a young person making a choice." What I was hearing didn't sound like a mistake. It had started, she told me, with a phone call in March. My daughter had been over for a Sunday dinner, one of the regular ones she'd started doing more of once the engagement was announced, and at some point during the meal her fiancé had stepped into the front sitting room to take a call. My housekeeper had been clearing plates and had passed close enough to catch fragments of it without meaning to eavesdrop, the way you sometimes overhear things simply by existing in the same house as someone having a conversation they think is private. He'd been talking about trust structures, she said, specific language, the kind of thing you don't use casually in conversation, terms like accelerated distribution and persterpes and disclaimer trust. I don't know what half of that means even now, but I know what it doesn't sound like, and it didn't sound like idle conversation between two people happy about a wedding. It sounded like research. She had filed it away, she said, the way you file away most things that seem odd but not yet actionable, telling herself she'd probably misheard or misunderstood the context, or that there was some perfectly reasonable explanation involving prenuptial planning that happens in plenty of families without anything sinister behind it. In April, she had taken a phone message. My daughter's fiancé had called while my daughter was out, asking her to call him back. Nothing unusual on its face. My housekeeper had written the message down on the notepad we kept by the kitchen phone, and had, without particularly meaning to, pressed down harder than she needed to, the way you sometimes do when your hand is thinking about something other than the note it's writing. When she tore the sheet off to leave it for my daughter, she noticed the impression was still visible on the page beneath. A name, a phone number. She hadn't written the name down anywhere, she told me. She had simply looked it up on the library computer out of what she described as an uneasy curiosity she couldn't quite justify to herself. The name belonged to a law firm, a relatively well-known one, with a practice that specialized, among other things, in estate litigation and in what their own website described, with a discretion she found almost darkly funny in retrospect, as complex family wealth transitions. I sat that up a bit at that detail, and asked her why my daughter's fiancé would have any reason to be calling an estate litigation firm room 4 months before their engagement was even a year old. She told me she'd asked herself the same question and hadn't had an answer at the time. She'd filed it away as well. In May, she said, she'd heard something clearer. She had been upstairs in the guest room, the window open because the weather had turned warm early that year, and my daughter had been in the garden below on the phone, her voice carrying up in a way that voices sometimes do in gardens on still afternoons, in a way she probably hadn't accounted for. My housekeeper had heard 2 sentences with enough clarity that she said she could have testified to them under oath if it had ever come to that. She heard my daughter say, "She trusts me completely. She has no reason not to." And then a few moments later, "She won't see it coming. She never does." My housekeeper told me she had sat down on the edge of the guest bed after hearing that and stayed there for a long time. She told me she had spent a good portion of that evening asking herself honest, uncomfortable questions, whether she was reading something sinister into what might simply be an ordinary conversation taken out of context, whether her fondness for me, built up over 11 years, was making her suspicious of a young couple who might just be discussing something entirely unrelated to what she was imagining, whether she had any business at all inserting herself into a family matter that wasn't hers to investigate. She had decided, she told me, that she needed more before she came to me with anything, that bringing me a collection of overheard fragments and a bad feeling wasn't fair to either of us, that if she was going to disrupt my life with a suspicion this serious, she needed to be as certain as she could reasonably become first. What she had found in the weeks since, she said, was enough. She had gone to the public library, which didn't have the same computer she'd used to look up the law firm's website, but had internet access and, more importantly, didn't require an account tied to her name the way our home internet did. She had started, cautiously, methodically, looking into my daughter's fiancé's background, the sort of background check anyone can conduct if they know where to look and are willing to spend an afternoon doing it. He had been married before, she told me. Not briefly, not in some early relationship that ended amicably before either party had accumulated much. He had been married for 7 years to a woman in a different province, and the divorce had been finalized barely 2 years before he ever met my daughter. The proceedings, according to court records my housekeeper had located and printed at the library, because she didn't own a printer and didn't want to use mine in case I came across the pages before she was ready to show them to me, had involved a protracted and unusually contentious dispute over an inheritance his first wife had received from her own mother's estate partway through their marriage. He had not won that dispute outright, my housekeeper told me, but he had, according to the record, delayed the final settlement for the better part of 2 years, long enough that his first wife's legal costs had consumed a substantial portion of what she'd ultimately been entitled to, and long enough that, according to a brief and rather bitter interview the first wife had apparently given to a small regional publication at the time, she had described the experience as watching someone try to make an inheritance not worth having by the time you actually received it. He had done this before, my housekeeper said, setting the printed pages down on the table between us with a careful precision of someone laying out evidence she had rehearsed presenting, not in an identical way. The mechanics were different, this time involving a living mother rather than an inheritance already legally settled. But the outline, she said, the underlying shape of it, was recognizably the same. Find a way to accelerate access to money that technically belonged, or would eventually belong, to someone he loved. Find a way to make the waiting period the enemy. I sat with the printed pages in front of me and did not touch them for a long moment. I looked instead at my housekeeper, at this woman who had spent 3 months of her own time, without being asked, quietly assembling a case against the man my daughter intended to marry, because something in a garden conversation had sounded wrong to her, and she had refused to let herself look away from it the way I apparently had been looking away from smaller versions of the same wrongness for months. I asked her eventually why she hadn't come to me sooner, once she'd found the court records, once she had something concrete rather than fragments. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. Because the court records only told me about him, she said. They didn't tell me whether your daughter knew what she was marrying, or whether she was being managed by someone very good at managing people. I needed to know which one it was before I put you through hearing it, because those are 2 very different griefs, and I didn't want to hand you the wrong one by mistake. I understood, sitting there, why she had needed the closet. Court records about a man's first marriage could be explained away, argued around, dismissed as ancient history that had nothing to do with the man he'd become since. What she had needed, what she had been quietly waiting 3 months for an opportunity to arrange, was for me to hear it directly, in my daughter's own voice, so that there would be no explaining away, no benefit of the doubt left to extend. She had needed me to hear my daughter's voice specifically, and not filtered through anyone else's account of it, including her own. I want to say something here about the particular kind of loyalty this represents. There is a kind of care that announces itself, that wants credit for its own devotion, and there is another kind that does the difficult, unglamorous work quietly, for months, expecting nothing, prepared to never need any of it if the worst version of events never came true. My housekeeper had spent 3 months hoping she was wrong. So had I. Without knowing there was anything specific to hope about, she hadn't wasted those afternoons at the library. I did not go to the graduation. This was one of the harder decisions I have made as a parent, because I had wanted that morning for 3 years, and some part of me argued, in the hours right after my housekeeper finished talking, that I should go anyway, that I should sit in that auditorium and hold what I knew separately from what I felt, the way adults are supposedly able to do. I found, when I actually tried to put on my coat and get in the car, that I could not do it. I could not sit in a room and watch her receive an honor while the sound of her voice discussing the statistical convenience of my death was still echoing in my ears. My housekeeper called the university on my behalf, said I'd taken unwell rather suddenly, finally, and I spent the morning of my daughter's graduation sitting at my own kitchen table instead, making phone calls I never imagined I would need to make. I called my lawyer first. She had handled our family's affairs for over a decade and had a way of listening that made it clear she was absorbing every detail rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. I told her everything, in order, the way my housekeeper had told me, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line when I finished. "I'm going to need you to come in first thing tomorrow morning," she said finally, "and I want to say this clearly. Nothing you do from this point forward should tip either of them off that you know anything. Don't change your behavior. Don't cancel anything. Don't confront anyone until we've had time to think through this properly and put protections in place. What you have right now is knowledge. What you don't have yet is anything that can't be undone if you move too quickly." She gave me the name of a second lawyer, one who specialized specifically in family and estate matters more complex than the routine work my regular lawyer typically handled. A woman with a reputation, my lawyer said, for asking exactly the right uncomfortable questions and for never being rushed by anyone into a decision she hadn't fully thought through. I called my son next in another province, and that was, without question, the hardest call of the day. He asked me 3 times if I was certain about what I'd heard, not because he doubted me, but because I think some part of him needed to hear me say yes 3 times before he could let himself believe it was real. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked what I needed from him, and I found I couldn't answer him right away because I was too busy being grateful that I still had one child I didn't need to be afraid of. The following week unfolded with a kind of careful, deliberate slowness that felt at odds with how urgently my whole body wanted to act. I met with both lawyers. I signed an amendment to the trust that restructured it in ways designed, my new lawyer was careful to explain, not to punish my daughter specifically, but to remove the particular incentive structure that made accelerating my death financially advantageous to anyone. The trust would still eventually provide for both my children equally. It would simply no longer reward impatience. My housekeeper had kept everything, it turned out, beyond what she'd already shown me. Every printed page from the library, a private log she had apparently kept since May, dates and times and what she'd overheard, written in a school notebook she'd bought for the purpose and kept in her own home rather than mine, because, she told me, she'd hoped she would never actually need to show it to anyone, but she'd wanted to be thorough in case it ever mattered. 11 years working in a house teaches you, I think, exactly how much thoroughness costs you in the moment and exactly how much it can be worth later, and she had apparently decided it was worth it before she had any proof at all that it would be. I asked my daughter to come for lunch the following Saturday. I spent the days beforehand deciding, as deliberately as I could manage, what kind of mother I wanted to be walking into that conversation. I am not someone who performs grief or anger easily. I process things privately and tend to arrive at decisions quietly, in a way my husband used to find admirable and occasionally, he admitted, a little unnerving. I decided I did not want to ambush her. I did not want to hand her the opportunity to feel attacked, to retreat behind her fiancé's version of events, to tell herself that I was simply the difficult, controlling mother he had apparently, at some point, described me as. She arrived carrying yellow tulips, the flowers she'd known I liked since she was a teenager, and hugged me in the doorway with what felt, infuriatingly, like genuine warmth, and I held on perhaps a beat longer than usual and said nothing about why. My housekeeper had made lunch and excused herself for the afternoon, understanding without being told that this conversation needed to happen without an audience, even a trusted one. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had learned everything the previous Saturday, and I let her talk about wedding plans for nearly 20 minutes before I said anything at all. The venue was confirmed, something about centerpiece flowers. I listened and watched her and tried to reconcile the daughter in front of me, animated and apparently happy, with the voice I'd heard through a closet door, and found that I could not fully manage it, that both versions of her seemed to exist simultaneously without canceling each other out, which was its own kind of vertigo. "I need to tell you about some changes I've made to your father's trust," I said eventually, and I watched her go still in a way that told me some part of her had been braced for this conversation since the moment she walked through the door, whether or not she'd have admitted that to herself. I told her, clearly, and without raising my voice, what I had heard. I did not accuse her of anything I hadn't directly heard her say. I did not need to embellish it. What I had heard was already more than sufficient. She did not deny it. I want to be honest that this was, in some ways, worse than if she had denied it. Worse than tears or anger or any of the responses I had spent the week half expecting and bracing myself against. She sat very still, looking at the tulips she'd brought, and said nothing for what felt like a genuinely long time. "He said you'd never understand," she said eventually, and her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone choosing words she'd clearly already rehearsed at some point, perhaps for exactly this conversation. "He said you'd always find some way to keep control of the money, that you liked having us need to ask you for things." "I know," I said. "That's the story that makes what the two of you did make sense to you. It's a story that lets you be the reasonable one." She flinched at that, a small movement, barely visible, but I saw it. I slid the printed court records across the table toward her, the pages my housekeeper had gathered at the library over 3 careful months. His first wife's name was there, along with 2 years of litigation and the specific documented shape of a pattern he had apparently walked before, with someone else's inheritance, before he ever met my daughter. She didn't open the folder, she also didn't push it away. We sat in a silence that I recognized as a particular kind she'd always had, even as a small child, a willingness to sit inside something uncomfortable rather than immediately fill it with words, and I let her have that silence for as long as she needed it, because I had always considered it one of her better qualities. possibilities, and I found even then that I still did. I didn't know about her, she finally said quietly. His first wife. I didn't know any of that. I know you didn't, I said. He wouldn't have told you that part. It doesn't fit the version of himself he needed you to believe in. She asked after another long silence, what happens now? And I told her the truth, which was that the trust was already protected, that this had not been done as punishment, but as something her father and I had built specifically for her and for her brother, and that I intended to keep it that way regardless of what she decided to do next. I told her I was not asking her to leave him. That decision, I said, was entirely hers to make, and I would not pretend I had the right to make it for her, however much a part of me wanted to. I told her I was still her mother, and that this remained true regardless of what she chose, and that I hoped eventually she would understand why I hadn't been able to sit in that auditorium and watch her graduate the way I'd looked forward to for 3 years. She left 2 hours later with the folder tucked under her arm, unopened but no longer left behind. I stood at the front window and watched her car go down the street, and I thought, as I often still do when something significant happens, about how much I wished I could have called my husband and told him about all of it, and how he would have known, better than I currently did, exactly what to say to make this feel survivable. The wedding did not happen in September. My daughter called 3 weeks later to say it was postponed, not canceled, and I didn't push for anything more than that. She came for dinner the following Sunday, just the two of us. We didn't talk about him. At the door, putting on her coat, she stopped in the same hallway and said she hadn't told him anything after that morning, that once she understood I knew, she'd gone quiet. I asked why she hadn't come to me directly instead. She was quiet again, in that old way of hers, before she said she thought she'd been ashamed. I still keep my husband's coats in that closet. I have never quite managed to give them away, and after that morning, I stopped feeling any need to explain why. Sometimes, reaching past them for an umbrella, I stand there a moment longer than I need to, in the particular quiet of the small dark space that once held the worst 30 minutes of my life, and my daughter's hand closing around a door handle 6 inches from my face.